Hello everyone. So this is part 4 of our series in looking at the astrological energy in the fall of 2024 and how these sequences are creating this highly integrated, complex energy between the various planets, these archetypal energies that are working through humanity. And in part 4, I'm actually going to take a look at the full moon that was just passed on October 17th. You might be saying, well, why look at what's past? Well, there's two very important reasons. And one of these is because the way that the energy formed up, it is continuing to unfold as the planets continue to move into the position to activate something very unique that I'm going to talk about in a minute. The other reason is that what we have here next to the moon is Chiron, and this position of Chiron is it's relatively the same as it was in the eclipse at April 8th. And furthermore, that is the position of Chiron when the United States was formed. So in other words, we are having a Chiron return. We are revisiting the energy that in the human being has to do with achieving specialized knowledge and the uniqueness that you give to the world through working through the pain of life or the challenges of life. They may not always be a pain or a wound, but we often refer to it as the wounded healer because it is a very shamanic energy. It changes things in a rather unique way. So, but in terms of the United States, Chiron, and in this case, the Chiron and the moon are in Aries at this time of the full moon. And Chiron in Aries has been thought to be the essence of how might we be feeling wounded in our identity that doesn't allow us to express fully who we are. And conversely, how are we acting with courage to create that identity, to bring it into full, and to sorry, we have activity in the neighborhood right now. People whizzing around on their vehicles. Anyway, it's that idea of the woundedness to one's identity. Like, who are you? And how you're working through that in your own kind of pioneering way with some kind of courage to form that identity and developing your own unique, specialized knowledge that might, we call it the wounded healer, but it might be healing, but it might be music, it might be, which can also be healing, but it might be some other specialized skill, and it's related to how you form your identity and how you act with courage in the world and lead in the world. And so with the United States Chiron, there's lots of discussions about what does that mean. And in the case of one of the things that we can think about is like what was going on 50 years ago, between 48 and 52 years ago. That gives us a clue. And some of the things that were going on were all of these movements for people whose identity were not being inclusive. So we had the women's movement, we had the movement for caring for the earth better instead of conquering it. It's like, how are we, one of the Aries mysteries is having the courage to restore justice. That aspect of the higher expression of warriorship is restoring justice in the world. So some of these different things. We also had in the United States, we had a president who used corrupt means to stay in power. and our system challenged that. And so there's lots of things that can go into this. There's the idea of being a singular person. There's one of the other aspects of the United States identity has to do with this rugged individualism. That's Aries. Being a rugged individual to make your mark. And there's certain ways that certainly played out in the United States history. It took a lot of courage for people from a different world, set aside what happened to Native Americans for a moment, but people from the old world coming here, leaving behind what they knew, and having that courage to do that and to strike out to create a new life for themselves. So rugged individualism, and it filters through a whole bunch of things. It's also been suggested that the unevolved side of that Chiron is the notion of exceptionalism. America has this notion that we're exceptional in the world. Some ways maybe, but not. We're not the best in everything that we do, and that sometimes blocks how we are functioning. So the Chiron of the United States, and I don't feel like I've done an exhaustive explanation of that, or even maybe nailed it yet, but to remember back, this is about the time of the Revolution, and one of the things that we did is we orphaned ourselves from the parent company, which is a Chiron thing, in order to set out and to do something new. We also said no to a king, that we're no longer going to be controlled by a single or an elite group of people, a single monarch, that we were going to govern ourselves. So anyhow, this was very potent, and the eclipse that crossed all of North America, all of Turtle Island on April 8th, activated a lot of energies, and we traveled that eclipse path on a spiritual mission, doing ceremonies along the way to activate both positive energies along that path as well as helping to clear and lift out, or at least that's the prayer, that over time, the dragon energy is not us, not us puny single humans. We just chose to say yes to it. And by we, it was my idea, but my friend Fenella traveled along with that, and eventually other people engaged in it, doing the earth web weaving, through love and gratitude. We can create energy streams between different places and lift it into the future. So we called it the Dragon of Peace and Transmutation. And so the United States is going through a year of its Chiron return. It was highly activated by that eclipse, and it's almost as if we have to constantly grow into the energy of Chiron, like some of the other planets. But we're certainly revisiting the things that weren't, that were woundedness. Not everybody got to be their own individual and, to make their way in the world. So anyhow, lots of those things kind of going on. Well, the moon activated that. So now at the full moon time, how one felt on an individual basis. How did you feel about being the unique individual that you are? And how did you feel about having the courage to continue to create that individuality with the specialized knowledge that you have? So this was significant for those reasons. And the two main reasons, again, just to reiterate, was that what happened at the full moon, and I'm going to show you this pattern that came in that was amazing and continues to unfold over the next several weeks, but especially the new moon, which I'm going to get to in segment 5. The new moon that's just days away right now. Anyway, that reason, and because it reflects back to the solar eclipse on April 8th, and a lot of people connected and will want to know more about that. I'm probably going to talk, I gave you a brief iteration of that, and there'll be more about how to connect with it on a personal level in part B. So this one's going to be 4A and there will be a 4B. So let me show you something very interesting about the patterns that are unfolding. So here we have a star tetrahedron that I made. And some of you are familiar with this form. And it is, when you look down on it, you can see that there are two triangles. And a lot of you are familiar with that, so I don't know if I need to go into this in depth, but there are two triangles that are interlaced. But in fact, what we're really seeing is these two tetrahedra that are interlaced, these four-sided pyramids. It's a little hard to show that maybe, but anyhow, this two-dimensional symbol is these two intersecting triangles. And this also represents sacred geometry and is known to represent Merkaba. Merkaba it literally means the merging of spirit and body in a container of light. So a lot of people refer to this form as Merkaba, but it's the energy field that you can create from this form. But that doesn't matter. It's okay. I don't want to get too technical. We can call it Merkaba. It represents it. So here I want to show, you can see in the shadow that when we turn it, now it looks quite different. And even though this is, it's a little bit extended because of the angle of the sun, but when you tilt it up enough, you can actually see that there's a square or a cube when you look at it from another direction. So we go from two intersecting triangles, and you go down, and a little hard to see in this form, but when you got it at the angles right, and the video isn't going to quite do that, but it becomes a cube. You can certainly see that it's a square from here to here and so on. But the shadow impression gives us a little better sense. So there's a notion that these highly integrated and intersecting forms, these two tetrahedra, and there are more connections even beyond that, but this two tetrahedra, we go from these intersecting triangles and a kind of energy field into a cube form, that they're all interrelated. And there's a sense of which that the mastery of these creates a vehicle of incubation. I'll just use a play on words. You know, they often think of the Merkaba as a vehicle or a chariot of the Creator, a great mystery, a vehicle, a light body vehicle. But there's also the sense of, if you're bringing spirit into matter, there's an incubation that takes place. So with that, I'm going to show you some of the patterns that the planets were forming. Okay, friends, so I'm going to talk about how that pattern that I just showed you, the star tetrahedron that represents the Merkaba, and how it transforms or really contains within it all of these other different geometries, these sacred geometries, and how they're linked. And one of the things about that is there's usually, well, there's several edges often, but there's an edge that intersects between those two forms. And what I'm showing here is just the form we had been working with that formed up at the equinox, and the trine being from from Uranus to Pluto, and at the equinox it was with the sun. And in the middle, opposite it, was Neptune. And but now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about this trine, and what formed up was another trine. But in terms of the sun is no longer there, the square symbol that's in the front of this field is, when we turn around and look at the face of it, that is Vesta. The asteroid Vesta moved into that position, which kind of amplifies the whole notion of Vesta. Vesta represents keeping the inner fire of spirit intact within us, doing what is necessary to maintain our temple, to adjust to changing patterns and the flow of life. And on a simple level, how is your ordinary life working? And in this case, being opposite Neptune, those patterns and the way that you're keeping your own inner spirit alive should reflect your beliefs and your aspirations, what you dream, and the highest expression in Neptune being universal love, universal compassion, and vision, high vision, and unity consciousness. But it also, in the collective, it represents the collective unconscious. All of those formless ideas that we feel them into them, and we bring them forward, and they come through in our ordinary lives. It can come through as beautiful music because it helps us to get to another state of consciousness. Or it can be any other art forms that are expressing what's going on at this deep feeling level in the collective. But it can also be the repository of anything that we bring forth and imagine, and what we feed it is what it's going to reflect back. So if you're feeding it fearful visions or bringing forth dark visions, then it becomes the ground from which new realities are created. We believe in them collectively. So if there's enough lies and deception, for example, pretty soon that becomes the truth that people believe in. So there's an element of faith that is very strong, faith and belief that is strong with Neptune and a whole feedback mechanisms. I mentioned in previous, we could go into a great deal of discussion about the pattern that I'm showing you right here, the minus the moon and Chiron, but that pattern, because the outer planets are transpersonal, they're big collective energies, and we do interact with them on an individual basis, but they function on a broad collective basis, and they're very complex. But this is the one that remains stable, and that each of these inner planets comes along and activates. So what does that represent? In reference to what I was showing with the interconnected geometry of the Merkaba, or the star tetrahedron, is that this pattern remains intact. And as these inner planets come by and activate it, there is high integration, high communication, if you will, between our personal energies and how those personal energies are playing out in the world, and what is going into the collective. That's significant. That's very important. It means that these times, these fall of 2024, and as I said, the equinox was important because that sets the tone for those 3 months, of which we're through about one of those months. And so these planets keep getting activated, and they're creating a pattern that resembles that star tetrahedron. interlaced trines, oppositions, and a square. So I'm going to show you that in a minute. Actually, we're going to have Fenella. She's going to stretch out so it's the orange marking tape that created the first trine, and at the full moon on October 17, there was another trine that interlaced between these planetary energies. And now it's not an exact connection between them because they work differently. So if you were looking at the chart, this is the pattern you would have seen looking at a piece of paper. But by doing this out here outside in this form that some might think, well, why didn't you just use the technology? Well, because it makes it more real. And when the planets are connected to their positions in the sky, and the idea that in the introduction, the part 1, when I said this anchors it in the earth plane and reminds us that this is happening with the earth and with us. So anyhow, so there's the two grand trines intersecting with each other. So the planets involved, those archetypal energies involved, are working together in a constructive and positive way, or a constructive, easy flowing way. Because the truth is, it doesn't mean that it's always positive. You know, I have to say, it doesn't always mean that. So now you see that particular pattern, and so now Fenella, yes. Fenella is going to use the green marking tape to show us that opposition that we've been talking about, which in this case, at the time of the full moon, was Vesta opposite Neptune. Kind of bringing your vision down to earth, into your practical life and how you conduct yourself in ceremony, or seeing how you conduct your life as a ceremony that reflects your vision and your dream. So that's the opposition. And to remind you that it's the opposition that can be what it sounds like, opposing each other at, the big dream versus the practical life. But when they flow together and inform each other, they become like the lemniscate. And ideally, we would take that green tape and turn it into an infinity symbol. But reflection or opposition creates awareness, and when we activate it, there is more creativity that can happen. Otherwise, there's tension. So now the next opposition, this is the one we've been talking about, that keeps getting activated over and over again, which is why Neptune is a particular focus. That's what was our focus at the equinox ceremony, and it just continues to get activated. And it is, that midpoint between Uranus and Pluto, the evolution and revolution, and the dream we're holding to support that. Okay, so while Fenella is laying out the next opposition that formed up, I forgot to mention that the other grand trine, at least I think I forgot, because you can't see those symbols. When I go back down to it, we'll see them. That is, she's connecting right now Uranus to Venus. And the other grand trine from Venus to Neptune is over to Mars. So Venus and Mars are in this supportive, constructive position with Neptune. That higher vision, or perhaps a deception, and then how our active element working with our receptive element, what we value and how we are acting to protect or bring that value about. Also a very creative thing. So that grand trine is pretty creative and brings it a little more down to earth. All right, so that opposition that she just drew in, you see that it is dissecting both of the triangles. And so you see now why the oppositions become key to the integration between these in significant ways, because we have more awareness of them. So let's take an example. If Uranus, which you can see in this view, is the idea of being free and equal individuals, and opposite it is Venus. And by the way, Uranus in Taurus, so it suggests that there should be a revolution in our values and what we and our support of the life of the planet, for example. And since our current system values through money, it's to change our system of money. Opposite it in Venus, in Scorpio, that represents the holding a space with our passion for empowerment, for collective empowerment, and to transform to that end. So Venus, what you want to attract into life, that receptive aspect that has to do with our values. And so there's a strong interlaced energy here. And I'm not going to overemphasize the idea that we often think of Venus representing women and Mars representing men, because that, I think, puts us into too narrow a category and couldn't become divisive. But nevertheless, it does seem to be active in our current state of consciousness and being. We haven't evolved very far to know that we can state that Venus is a part of all of us and that Mars is a part of all of us, but it's still somewhat separated. All right, so we'll go to the next opposition. So Fenella is drawing out the opposition between Pluto and Mars on the left. And now you see taking shape that form that we were looking at that is so like the Merkaba or star tetrahedron. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that opposition because that one is one of the most critical. And so I'm only going to mention it and that allow you to see this pattern. And when we go back, when I get down off the roof and go down into the space, then I will talk about it at more length, because it is the opposition that links it to the grand square or the cubing that was happening at the same time that the full moon activated. So now she will draw in that full moon opposition. So the first three oppositions we drew in connect the two intersecting triangles. And hopefully you can see that because they're drawing from one point of one triangle to another. And so it's kind of bridging that geometry. This one, with the full moon, the sun is here to my right, and it's the moon with Chiron. That creates an opposition that if you focus on Pluto-Mars, Pluto that you can see in the upper right, Mars that is turned on edge to the left, and the line she just drew between the sun and the moon, can you see that it forms a cross? And so what results is what we refer to as a grand cross or a grand square. Normally, this is a very difficult energy to resolve. But when it is happening in conjunction with these other forms, this highly integrated dynamic energy form takes place. So we'll put in now the the grand square aspect. And squares are challenging. They're very challenging, but they're dynamic. When they become less, when their difficulty is resolved in a positive way, where each one is allowed to express its energy in turn, then something very powerful, dynamic, and creative can happen. But until then, it's a pretty difficult energy. So we'll fill that in right now. So as she draws that in, and hopefully that hot pink shows up as different, but here's the grand square. It's Mars, which is in the sign of Cancer, which is an element of the courage to protect, support, and nurture what one considers to be family, to the sun. And so it is, in a sense, it is at odds with that moon Chiron, which is trying to assert its individuality or feel like an individual within the family. And because it's Mars, which we can't see the glyph for, because it's pointed at us, and we'll go back down and see that, it wants to assert itself, and it could manifest as cutting itself off and choosing dividing what is family, what's considered family, and what is not. And we would like to view this as Mars supporting all of the human family and non-human family alike. That's the way it would function at a higher level, to protect, support, and nurture life, ultimately, but the whole human family, versus it taking its own individual direction and perhaps separating itself off or even going against other members of the family. And so how we feel about our individuality and how we're protecting the family is highly activated in that square. And then that moon squared to Pluto, on the negative side, that could be trying to manipulate based on your emotions to change and force a particular point of view. Or it can be allowing transformation based on a feeling nature, and can also be empowering that feeling nature. And remember, it's with Chiron. So who we are as individuals with our own specialized knowledge. And the other square is Pluto to the Sun, and that can represent, once again, someone believing that they are the center of everything and should have all the power in an extreme. Sometimes Pluto square the Sun represents something dictatorial, and but it can also be shining from one's heart with generosity in a way that supports the collective empowerment of all. And then you have the Sun back to Mars again. And that one can often be triggering of anger whenever we feel our identity in the person now, not collectively, but it works out collectively. That if you don't feel that you as an individual are being allowed to express, then you might be quick to anger, become defensive, etc. So there you have, now it's looked like a lot of lines running all around, which is kind of what happens when we look at the chart. The grand square with the hot pink shows up, and the grand cross is embedded in these two green lines. But remember, the green lines, the oppositions, As I mentioned in the very beginning in part one, the oppositions are sometimes the key, particularly in how these patterns get resolved, because once you become aware and allow a flow back and forth, there's resolution instead of just fighting against each other. And so there's the Grand Cross, and then back to where we have the bisection of these triangles that interconnects the triangles, which are the flowing and constructive energy. So on the individual basis, we have Mars working with Venus, working with Neptune, our activity, our value system, and what we dream of and hold as high aspirations. And we have Uranus, the revolutionary, and the idea of equality and unique expression, working with Pluto to transform the systems to support that. And back to Vesta in this case. And Vesta, even though it is an asteroid, holds that particular energy of what patterns can we create that keep the fire of the inner spirit intact. And so that's all fairly complicated, but you see how it interweaves. And if you think back to what I showed you, how the Merkaba, when you look down on it, comes in, you view it from another angle and you see that it is in fact a cube as well. Now, let's talk for a moment about how that sun and moon, and I think for that I might go down into that circle with all the lines in it to explain the rest. All right, so we're representing the Earth here in the middle of this circle with this Tai Chi symbol, the yin yang, in blue and green. And as we spoke of before, the moon is, when there is a full moon, is what we tend to focus on because it is so dramatic when it rises and we're focused on the moon and the intensity of our feeling and response to things going on in the world around us and personally. And so, but it was in Aries, and I talked about that at length. But opposite it is the sun that is lighting it up. So in this case, the moon in Aries, about our individuality and how we are acting with courage to bring our individuality out into the world, but what is shining on it? And what can be either supportive of or pushing against it? It's the sun in Libra. So what that represents is that in equal relationship, in co-creative equal relationship, so we'll just focus on the idea of relationship, balanced, equality, is that supporting how you're feeling as an individual with your own unique talents and specialized knowledge. And the Libra also represents the idea of a civil society, of where there are social norms of respect that support that balance and equality. And so one of the ways to think about that is that on an individual basis is the social environment that you're a part of, is that supporting how you're feeling about yourself and your specialized knowledge, and vice versa. So maybe you need to make changes around one or both of those ideas. Maybe if the community that you belong in or that you are connected to is not supporting you as an individual, so maybe you need to change your relationships, who you're connected to. So that's the potency of that. It really highlighted that. And as I said earlier, it also brings to the fore how the United States as a nation is expressing equality, balance, a social environment that supports harmony and beauty, Sun in Libra, so that individuals are able to feel comfortable with not only their specialized knowledge, but their wounding and their individuality. Very important and a key element here. And that forms one of the portions of the Grand Cross, that opposition, and one of the corners of the Grand Square. So remember, I mentioned Pluto can be the drive to control things, to take power on the collective level, as we've spoken of many times. Pluto is in a position where it is breaking down the rules, the structures, institutions, all the things that we feel are the solid and enduring ways that society works. Maybe not all of the things, but many of the things. And the idea that some people want to grab the power that is inherent in that structure versus the idea of collective empowerment. So the death of old structures should bring about a regeneration of new that supports more collective empowerment. Now, here is, by the way, here's the symbol of Vesta that is opposite Neptune. That's my little funky little piece of artwork to create Vesta. Again, that inner light of spirit and how we keep it intact and lit and going through taking care of ourselves. The temple of our body, our home, everything really that creates the patterns that support that. Now here is the opposition that is the hinge point between those two trines and the Grand Square. Because they occupy, Mars occupies the corner of one of the triangles, Pluto occupies the corner of the other triangle, and it occupies two of the corners of the Grand Square or Grand Cross. Now, this is an intense kind of energy because it can by itself produce aggressive, angry energy that individuals might take because they feel like they don't have control over their environment or someone else is trying to control them. And Mars opposite Pluto is notorious for sometimes producing, not always, but producing violence. And this, as I mentioned before, Mars is in Cancer and Pluto is in Capricorn. And so the breakdown of the external patterns or the structures by which we organize ourselves individually as also our society and how we go about getting what we want and using our passion for creating our individuality. And when those clash, or they could be a feedback loop, as I mentioned, the key here is that opposition, if we view it as the lemniscate or the infinity symbol, then the actions we take with our family, how we broadly define family, I define it as all of humanity and our non-human family as well. You know, our relatives out there, the trees and all of the creatures that are in my forest here. And collective empowerment through the structures that we're going to create. So, are you acting using your energy in a way of supporting family that is feeding back to how are these old structures, the ones that are worn out and not useful anymore, how are they being broken down and the power released to be creating new structures? Or are you fighting as an individual with those, with that general Pluto in Capricorn energy? And one of the keys here in terms of this end of the fall season 2024 is that Pluto in just a few weeks leaves the sign of Capricorn for 248 years. And so getting this right is really important. And it is suggestive of the notion that the ability to create something that is akin to the Merkaba, the merging of spirit and matter in a vehicle of light, is what is at stake. And that's why I am focusing on the pattern of the full moon. Even though it is past, we can always go back and examine how we felt and reacted to things. So on an individual basis, we can still examine how to work with this particular energy creatively, because it sets a tone until the next full moon for sure. And maybe beyond it because of where the positions of the planets are. And the other piece, again, is because this pattern continues to unfold, and we're going to see in segment 5 the new moon that is coming up in a few days, how it is still representing this star tetrahedron energy. So it keeps unfolding. It's not transient. So that's the other important piece, and why we have lots of opportunities to engage with this. And one of the challenges we have in this society today is the level of distraction that goes on, and the idea of not knowing what is true, not being able to pick out of all of these possibilities what is true. And it isn't always about how you feel, but the aspiration, which I focus on as universal love, unity, and compassion, because if that's your focus, then the exact vision that you're creating in your everyday life will have that contained within it. And so we may not know how things are going to turn out, but if we look at it from that point of view, I saw somebody write about that in the sense of just continue to do your practices, focusing on what we know universally. Every great teacher and religion, way of being, reflects those truths. That we're all one, that love is the core energy of the universe, and when we act with compassion towards each other, we find a way to cooperate and create amazing things. It's not to say that it's easy, because one person's idea of how to express themselves as a unique individual might interfere with another one's. So the challenge is creating from a societal level, a democracy where we're all unique individuals with the structures, and I don't have Saturn in there. Saturn is active here too, but it would get confusing. The kinds of structures and institutions that support that without creating interference. So it is confusing. We might want to feel like we want to escape. And remember, the flood of misinformation then becomes a basis of Neptune energies from which we draw. So it's important that we find ways to discern. And the highest aspiration is the highest truth. Aho Matakios.